"Look under your table," she whispered, her voice so soft it barely existed, and yet somehow, it was the loudest thing in the room. The crystal chandeliers above cast a warm golden glow across polished marble floors, reflecting off glasses of aged whiskey and plates that cost more than most people's weekly rent, but none of that mattered in that exact moment, because Dante Moretti, a man who had built an empire on instinct and control, froze mid-reach, his fingers hovering just inches from the rim of his glass as his dark eyes slowly lifted to meet hers. Not the table, not yet, just her, as if weighing whether the trembling waitress standing beside him was a threat, a fool, or something far more dangerous. Ava Jackson had mastered invisibility long before she ever stepped into the Velvet Room, the most exclusive private dining space in Manhattan where men like Dante made decisions that never appeared in headlines but shaped everything beneath them, and for 6 months she had moved silently between tables, memorizing faces without being seen, absorbing tones without being heard, surviving on tips and silence. But tonight's silence felt like betrayal because she had seen something she couldn't unsee. Something that turned the soft jazz music in the background into static in her ears and made every polished surface feel like a mirror reflecting danger. Just minutes earlier, while adjusting the linen beneath table 7, the one reserved for Dante and his inner circle, her hand had brushed against something that didn't belong, not part of the structure, not part of the design, something cold and deliberate hidden within the metal frame beneath the table, and in that instant a memory she had buried clawed its way back to the surface, the same unnatural placement, the same precision, the same quiet certainty that whatever it was had been put there by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She had stepped back immediately, her pulse racing, eyes darting across the room to see if anyone else had noticed, but the manager had been too busy laughing with a group of investors near the bar, and the other staff too focused on keeping glasses full and smiles intact, and when she tried to speak, when she tried to explain, she had been cut off with a dismissive wave and a sharp whisper to stay in her lane, because waitresses didn't interrupt VIP service, and they definitely didn't invent problems that didn't exist. So she did the only thing she had left to do, she broke the one rule that kept her safe, she stepped directly into Dante Moretti's space, leaned close enough to feel the stillness that surrounded him like a shield, and said the words that now hung between them like a blade suspended in air, "Look under your table." He didn't move, not immediately, his gaze stayed locked on hers, searching, calculating, and for a brief, suspended second the entire room seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the powerful man who trusted nothing and the invisible woman who had just risked everything, and somewhere beneath the polished calm of his expression, something shifted, not belief, not yet, but attention, the kind of attention that had built his empire and destroyed anyone who underestimated him, and as the low hum of conversation continued around them, unaware, unchanged, Dante slowly leaned back in his chair, his fingers no longer reaching for the glass but instead resting lightly on the edge of the table, as if listening not just to her words, but to the silence underneath them, the kind of silence that only appears when something is about to go terribly wrong. The room did not react, not yet, because nothing visible had changed, the same soft jazz continued to drift through the air, glasses still clinked gently, and conversations flowed like nothing had been interrupted, but under that polished surface something invisible had shifted, something only two people in that room could feel, and Ava Jackson felt at first as a tightening in her chest, the kind that came when a moment stretched too long, when a decision had not yet been made and everything depended on it, because Dante Moretti still had not looked under the table, he was still watching her, his eyes steady, unreadable, searching for the one thing that mattered more than anything else in his world, certainty. Ava's hands trembled at her sides, but she forced them. Still, pressing her fingers lightly against the tray she carried as if grounding herself in something real, because she knew what it meant if he dismissed her, she would be escorted out, her job gone, her name marked as a problem, and whatever she had seen would remain exactly where it was, waiting, silent, patient, but the memory in her mind would not let her step back, it replayed with sharp clarity, the cold metal brushing her skin, the unnatural placement, the slight resistance when she pressed against it, not loose, not accidental, something designed to stay hidden, and beneath that memory was another one, older, heavier, a moment years ago when she had ignored the same instinct, when she had told herself she was imagining things, when she had chosen silence over risk, and the cost of that silence had never truly left her. Dante shifted slightly in his chair, not away from her, but deeper into stillness, his fingers now resting flat against the table's surface, feeling, measuring, his mind moving through possibilities with the precision of a man who had survived by trusting patterns over appearances, and yet there was nothing obvious to confirm what she had said, no sound, no movement, no sign that anything beneath him posed a threat. And that was exactly what made it dangerous, because the most dangerous things in his world were never obvious. Around them, his guests continued speaking, one of them laughing softly at something that had just been said, another lifting a glass in a casual gesture, unaware that the center of the table had become something else entirely, a place where one unseen detail could change everything, and Dante's gaze flickered for the briefest moment toward the edge of the table, not down, not fully committing, just enough to acknowledge the possibility, before returning to Ava with a question that never needed to be spoken. How sure are you? Ava swallowed, the dryness in her throat sharp, and for a second her voice threatened to disappear completely, but she leaned closer, just enough to close the distance between uncertainty and conviction, her breath steadying as she spoke again, quieter this time, but with something stronger beneath it, not just under, she said, her eyes holding his without hesitation now, inside the frame. The words hung there, precise, deliberate, and something in them changed the balance, because Dante did not move immediately, but his stillness was no longer hesitation, it was calculation, and in that silent calculation, the room remained exactly as it was, unaware, untouched, balanced on the edge of a truth that had not yet revealed itself, while beneath the polished surface of steel and wood, something unseen waited, patient and perfectly hidden. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, Dante Moretti did nothing, and that nothing carried more weight than any sudden movement ever could, because men like him did not react, they verified, they observed, they waited until the invisible revealed itself, and yet something in Ava Jackson's voice, not the words but the certainty beneath them, had already shifted the equation, because she was no longer speaking like someone guessing, she was speaking like someone remembering, and that difference was something Dante recognized instantly. His fingers slid slightly along the edge of the table, not gripping, not tensing, just tracing the surface as if mapping its structure through touch alone, and then, almost imperceptibly, his foot moved beneath him, a subtle repositioning that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else in the room, but to Ava it felt like the world holding its breath, because he was finally acknowledging what she had said without fully committing to it, testing the space without exposing himself to it. Around them, nothing had changed. One of the men at the table leaned back in his chair, casually discussing numbers that sounded large enough to buy entire city blocks, another reached for a piece of bread, breaking it slowly, the quiet normalcy of the scene almost surreal against the tension coiled tightly beneath it, and still no one noticed the way Dante's attention had narrowed, the way his focus had locked onto something no one else could see. Ava did not move, she did not step back, even though every instinct told her to create distance, because distance now meant doubt, and doubt meant delay, and delay was the one thing she could not afford, so she stood there, steady, her eyes fixed on him, willing him to understand without needing another word. Dante exhaled slowly, the kind of controlled breath that signaled a decision forming, and then he did something so subtle it barely registered as action. He shifted his weight forward, just enough to lift the pressure off one leg of the table, not enough to draw attention, but enough to change the balance, and in that fractional adjustment, something answered. It was not a sound anyone else reacted to, not a noise that broke the flow of conversation, but Ava heard it because she was already listening for it, a faint, unnatural click from within the structure itself, not beneath, not outside, but exactly where she had said, inside the frame, and her heart dropped for a split second before rising again, faster, sharper, because that single confirmation turned everything from possibility into certainty. Dante's eyes flickered, just once, a microsecond shift that most people would never notice, but Ava saw it, the moment realization replaced doubt, and still he did not react outwardly, not yet, because reacting too soon would reveal too much, and whatever had been placed there had been designed to remain hidden until the last possible second. He leaned back slightly, returning the table's weight to its original position, restoring the illusion of normalcy, but now the illusion no longer held power over him, now he was inside it, and that changed everything, because Dante Moretti did not fear what he could not see, he studied it, he dismantled it, and in that quiet, controlled stillness, with the room still unaware and the danger still perfectly concealed. The balance had shifted completely, not toward chaos, but toward control, and for the first time since she had stepped forward, Ava realized that he believed her, not because of what she had said, but because of what he had just felt, and that silent agreement between them, unspoken and absolute, was the moment the unseen stopped being hidden and started being understood. The shift in balance was invisible to everyone else, but to Dante Moretti it was absolute, the kind of quiet confirmation that rewrote the rules of the room without a single word being spoken, and as he sat there, composed, steady, appearing unchanged to the untrained eye, his mind moved several steps ahead, not toward panic, never toward panic, but toward control, because whatever had been placed inside that table had not been meant for spectacle, it had been meant for precision, for timing, for a moment when attention would be elsewhere and reaction would come too late, and that meant one thing: whoever had said it expected him to remain exactly where he was. His gaze lifted slightly, not to Ava this time, but to the people seated around him, each face familiar, each presence accounted for, and yet now every detail carried a different weight, the way one man's hand rested too casually near his glass, the way another avoided eye contact just a fraction longer than necessary, small things, almost nothing, but in Dante's world, almost nothing was often everything. Ava felt the shift before she understood it, the way his attention moved off her and into the room, as if she had already served her purpose in his eyes, and for a brief second that realization stung, not because she expected gratitude, but because she suddenly understood that whatever happened next was no longer about her warning, it was about his response. And his response was something far more calculated than she could predict. She took a slow step back, not retreating completely, just enough to return to the role she was supposed to play, invisible, silent, but her eyes remained fixed on him, unable to fully disconnect from the moment she had set into motion. Dante reached for his glass again, finally completing the movement he had abandoned earlier, lifting it with the same measured ease that defined everything he did, and as the amber liquid caught the light, he allowed himself a small pause, just long enough to let the room settle into its illusion of normalcy, before placing the glass back down untouched, a gesture so subtle it drew no attention, but to Ava it felt deliberate, as if he were marking time rather than passing it. Then, without raising his voice, without altering his tone, he spoke to the table, his words smooth, controlled, carrying just enough authority to redirect attention without raising suspicion, suggesting a brief change in seating, a minor adjustment for comfort, nothing urgent, nothing alarming, just a simple shift that required everyone to move their chairs back slightly, to stand, to reposition, and as the others complied, some with mild confusion, others with casual acceptance, the structure of the table changed, the pressure redistributed, and for a fraction of a second the hidden mechanism responded again, that same faint internal adjustment Ava had heard before, now unmistakable in its intent. She felt her breath catch, but she did not move, did not react, because reacting would break the illusion, and the illusion was the only thing keeping the situation contained. Dante stood last, not rushed, not tense, just deliberate, and as he stepped away from the table, he placed one hand lightly against its edge, as if steadying himself, but in reality testing it one final time, confirming what he already knew, and in that moment, with everyone now on their feet and the table no longer bearing the same weight, the unseen threat lost its advantage, not removed, not exposed, but neutralized, its timing disrupted, its purpose delayed. The room remained calm, the music unchanged, the conversations resuming as if nothing had happened, but beneath that calm, a different kind of silence settled in, one that carried awareness instead of ignorance, and as Dante finally turned his head back toward Ava, his eyes met hers again, not with surprise, not with gratitude, but with something far more significant, recognition. The quiet acknowledgement that she had seen what others could not, and that because of that, the outcome of this moment had been rewritten without a single person in the room fully understanding why. The illusion held, but only on the surface, because beneath the soft glow of chandeliers and the polished rhythm of a high-end dinner, something had already been exposed, not to the room, not to the guests, but to Dante Moretti, and once something entered his awareness, it did not remain unresolved for long. He did not return to his seat immediately, instead he let the others settle first, watching how they moved, how they adjusted, how they reacted to the subtle shift he had introduced, and in those small, unguarded seconds, people revealed more than they ever intended, the slight hesitation of one man before sitting back down, the almost imperceptible glance exchanged between another and the far end of the table, details so minor they would disappear in any other setting, but here, under Dante's quiet scrutiny, they sharpened into signals. Ava remained a step back now, her tray steady in her hands, her posture returned to what it was expected to be, but inside she felt the weight of what she had started pressing against her ribs, because the danger had not disappeared, it had only changed shape, and that made it harder to read, not easier. She watched as Dante finally lowered himself back into his chair, but this time his positioning was different, subtle, calculated, his weight distributed in a way that avoided pressure on the exact point she had indicated, a detail so precise it confirmed to her that he had mapped the structure beneath without ever looking directly at it. He reached for his glass again, this time taking a slow sip, not out of habit, but as part of the performance, maintaining the normal flow of the evening, because control in a room like this was not about stopping everything, it was about ensuring nothing appeared to have stopped at all. Then, as if continuing a conversation that had never been interrupted, he spoke again, his tone even, his words directed toward one of the men across from him, asking a question about a deal, about timing, about delivery, but beneath the surface of that question was something else entirely, a probe, a test, and the response he received came just a fraction too quickly, just a little too rehearsed. And in that moment Dante's gaze sharpened, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for Ava to feel it from across the space. The man smiled, confident, relaxed, but his fingers tapped once against the table before going still, a small, involuntary motion that did not belong in a room where everyone prided themselves on control, and Dante saw it, he saw everything, and he filed it away without reacting, because reaction was not his first move, confirmation was. Ava's breath slowed as she realized what he was doing. He was not just avoiding the threat, he was tracing it back, following the invisible thread from the object to the person who had placed it there, and that realization sent a different kind of tension through her, one that had nothing to do with fear of the unknown and everything to do with the certainty that someone at that table had planned something they believed would go unnoticed. The music continued, soft and elegant, a piano melody that filled the spaces between words, and for anyone else in the room, the evening remained exactly what it appeared to be, a private dinner among powerful people, but for Dante, the night had shifted into something else entirely, a controlled environment where every movement, every glance, every word now carried weight, and as he leaned back slightly, his eyes moving once more across the table before briefly returning to Ava, there was no longer any question in his expression, only decision, because he was no longer asking whether there was a hidden threat, he was deciding how to reveal it, and more importantly, who had believed it would remain hidden long enough to matter. The decision settled into place without a single word announcing it, the kind of decision that did not need volume because it carried certainty, and Dante Moretti moved forward with it the same way he did everything else, quietly, precisely, without disrupting the surface of the moment he was controlling. He set his glass down with deliberate ease, the faint sound of crystal against polished wood blending seamlessly into the ambient noise of the room, and then he leaned slightly toward the table again, not enough to raise concern, but enough to bring his presence closer to the center of what he now understood, his eyes no longer scanning randomly but fixed with intent, narrowing in on the man seated 2 positions to his right. The man continued speaking, his tone smooth, confident, weaving through numbers and projections with the practiced rhythm of someone used to being listened to, but there was a slight shift now, a subtle tightening around his eyes, the kind that only appeared when a person felt a tension they could not explain, and Dante noticed it immediately. Ava felt it too, not the specifics, not the calculations unfolding in Dante's mind, but the direction of his focus, the way the air around that one seat seemed to grow heavier, more defined, as if the room itself had drawn a quiet boundary around it, and she realized that whatever thread Dante had followed, it had led him somewhere specific, somewhere human. She held her position, her breath slow and measured, because she understood now that the danger was no longer just beneath the table, it was seated at it. Dante spoke again, his voice calm, almost conversational, asking the man a simple question, something about timing, about why a particular arrangement had been scheduled for tonight instead of later in the week, a detail that should not have carried weight, but in the way Dante asked it, it became something else entirely, a test disguised as curiosity. The man paused, just for a fraction of a second too long, before answering, offering an explanation that sounded reasonable, but not natural, his words slightly too aligned, too polished, as if prepared in advance, and as he spoke, his hand rested lightly against the edge of the table, fingers brushing the surface in a way that mirrored Dante's earlier movement, but without the same control. Dante watched that hand, not openly, not in a way that would reveal his attention, but with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that truth often lived in the smallest gestures, and then, without warning, he shifted the conversation again, redirecting it to someone else, allowing the moment to pass, allowing the man to relax, to believe that whatever tension had existed was gone. But it was not gone, it had simply been catalogued. Ava felt the shift even before she understood it, the way the pressure in the room seemed to ease, conversations returning to their previous rhythm, laughter resuming in soft, controlled bursts, and yet beneath it all there was a different current. Now, one that she could not fully name, but could not ignore either, because she knew that Dante had already reached a conclusion, he was no longer searching, he was confirming. Then, with a movement so smooth it appeared almost casual, Dante adjusted his chair again, angling it just slightly away from the table, creating a subtle distance that would not be questioned, and as he did, his hand brushed the underside of the table's edge once more, not to test, but to locate, to mark the exact position of what had been hidden there, mapping it with the precision of someone preparing for a final move. He did not look at Ava this time, he did not need to, because whatever had begun with her warning had now evolved into something entirely his own, a controlled unraveling of a plan that had depended on his ignorance, and as he leaned back once more, his expression calm, his posture relaxed, there was a quiet finality in the way he settled into place, because the next step would not be a reaction, it would be a reveal, and when it came, it would not be loud, it would not be chaotic, it would simply leave no room for denial. The moment did not explode, it settled, and that was what made it so final, because Dante Moretti did not believe in dramatic reveals, he believed in quiet certainty, the kind that left no space for argument, and as he sat there, composed, watching the rhythm of the table return to what it had been, he allowed a few seconds to pass, just enough time for everyone to relax back into their roles, just enough time for the man he had identified to believe that whatever tension had flickered across the surface was gone. Ava could feel it too, the room exhaling, the subtle release of pressure as conversations resumed their steady flow, glasses lifted again, and the illusion of control reassembled itself around them, but she knew better now, she knew that the stillness in Dante was not the absence of action, it was the preparation for it. He reached forward once more, this time not for his drink, but for the linen napkin resting beside his plate, lifting it with calm precision and placing it across his lap as if settling in for the remainder of the evening. And in that simple gesture, something shifted again, not outwardly, but internally, because he had already decided that the next move would belong entirely to him. Then, without raising his voice, without interrupting anyone directly, he spoke, his tone smooth, almost conversational, but carrying just enough authority to draw attention, suggesting that before they continued, he would like to clarify one small detail, something about the table itself, a comment so unexpected it caused a brief pause in the conversation, a subtle ripple of confusion that moved through the group. The man to his right smiled, polite, curious, but there was a flicker there now, a brief tightening that had not been there before, and Dante saw it clearly. He leaned slightly forward, placing his hand flat against the table once more, not pressing, just resting, and then he said it, simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand, something inside this table is not part of its design. The words did not echo, they did not need to, because they landed with a weight that silenced the space around them, cutting through the music, through the conversation, through the carefully maintained illusion of control, and for the first time that evening, the room stopped pretending nothing was wrong. No one moved at first, not immediately, because the statement did not come with panic, it came with certainty, and certainty demanded attention. Ava felt her pulse rise, not in fear, but in recognition, because this was the moment everything shifted from unseen to undeniable. Dante did not look at the table as he spoke, he looked at the man he had already chosen, holding his gaze with calm intensity, and in that silence that followed, the smallest details became the loudest signals, the way the man's fingers curled slightly against the edge of his glass, the way his shoulders tightened just a fraction, the way his breath paused before resuming, all of it confirming what Dante already knew. No accusation was spoken, no name was called, but the weight of the room shifted unmistakably in that direction, attention narrowing, awareness sharpening, and suddenly the elegant setting no longer felt like a place of comfort, but a stage where something hidden had just been brought into the light. Ava stood still, her tray steady, her presence once again invisible to most, but not to him, not anymore, and as Dante held that silence, allowing it to do the work for him, the truth did not need to be forced, it revealed itself in the absence of denial, in the inability to maintain composure under the weight of being seen, and in that quiet, controlled moment, with no raised voices, no sudden movements, and no chaos to distract from it, the plan that had depended on invisibility collapsed. Under the simple power of being noticed. No one spoke at first, not because they did not understand what had been said, but because they understood it too well, and in a room built on power and control, certainty without explanation was far more unsettling than chaos, because chaos could be managed, but certainty demanded accountability. The man to Dante's right let out a quiet breath, almost imperceptible, as if resetting himself, and when he smiled again it was measured, practiced, the kind of smile that had carried him through countless negotiations, but now it carried something else beneath it, something strained, something that did not belong. "I am sure there is a simple explanation," he said, his tone even, controlled, but just a fraction too quick, just a fraction too eager to restore normalcy, and that fraction was all Dante needed. Dante did not respond immediately, he did not challenge the statement, he simply let it exist in the air between them, unacknowledged, allowing the silence that followed to do what words never could, to press, to reveal, to strip away the layers people use to protect themselves. Ava watched from where she stood, her heartbeat steady now, no longer driven by fear but by something sharper, awareness, because she could see it unfolding, not in dramatic gestures, not in raised voices, but in the subtle erosion of composure that came when someone realized they had been seen. Dante shifted slightly in his chair, his posture still relaxed, his presence still calm, but there was a quiet finality in the way he moved, as if the outcome of this moment had already been decided and he was simply allowing it to reach its natural conclusion. "Then we should not guess," he said softly, his voice carrying across the table with effortless authority, "we should verify." The word landed differently than the others, not as a suggestion, but as a direction, and for the first time, movement followed his words. One of the staff members hesitated, looking toward the manager for guidance, but the manager did not speak, did not intervene, because even he could feel the shift in control, the way the room now belonged entirely to Dante without him ever raising his voice. A second later, one of Dante's men stepped forward, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with quiet purpose, approaching the table with the same calm that defined everything Dante had done, and as he crouched slightly, examining the structure beneath, the illusion that had held the evening together began to fracture. Ava did not look away, even though every instinct told her to, because this was the moment her warning became reality, not just for Dante, but for everyone. The man seated to Dante's right remained still, his hands now resting flat against his thighs, his fingers no longer tapping, no longer moving, as if stillness itself could erase what had already been revealed, but stillness now only made the tension around him more visible, more defined, like a shadow that could not be ignored. Then came the confirmation, quiet, controlled, spoken just loud enough to be heard, that something had indeed been placed within the frame of the table, something that did not belong, something that had been hidden with intention, and with that single acknowledgement, the last piece of denial dissolved. No one reacted with shock, not outwardly, because shock would have meant surprise, and surprise had already passed, replaced by something heavier, something more deliberate, the understanding that this had not been an accident, that it had not been random, that it had been planned. Dante's gaze returned to the man beside him, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that was far more unsettling, the kind of calm that came when there was nothing left to question. And in that silence, with the truth now visible without needing explanation, the room no longer belonged to conversation or appearances, it belonged to consequence, quiet, controlled, and impossible to avoid. No one rushed to speak, because in that moment, words had lost their value, replaced by something far more decisive, the quiet weight of truth fully revealed and impossible to deny, and Dante Moretti did not need to raise his voice, did not need to accuse, because the room had already shifted in his favor, the balance no longer uncertain but firmly established. The man beside him sat motionless, his earlier confidence now reduced to a carefully controlled stillness that could not quite hide the tension beneath it, and that tension spoke louder than any defense he could offer. Dante turned his gaze away from him slowly, deliberately, not dismissing him, but placing him exactly where he belonged, no longer an equal at the table, but the center of a mistake that had just been uncovered. The staff member who had confirmed the hidden object stepped back, his role complete, leaving the space between revelation and consequence untouched, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to exist in that suspended space, where nothing moved and yet everything had already changed. Ava remained where she was, her tray still in her hands, her posture steady, but inside her something settled, something quiet and grounding, because what she had feared would be ignored had instead reshaped the entire evening, not through force, not through chaos, but through a single decision to speak when silence would have been easier. Dante reached for his chair and stepped away from the table, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with the calm authority of someone who no longer needed to stay seated to maintain control, and as he moved, the others followed without being told, instinctively creating space, shifting the structure of the room around him. He did not look back at the table again, not at the hidden mechanism, not at the place where the plan had been set, because it no longer mattered, the object had lost its power the moment it had been understood, and what remained now was not the trap itself, but the choice behind it. His attention returned, finally, to Ava, and for the first time since she had stepped forward, there was no distance in his gaze, no calculation, only recognition, clear and undeniable, the acknowledgement of someone who had altered the course of a moment that could have gone very differently. He stepped closer, closing the space between them in a way that did not intimidate, but clarified, and without a word, he reached for the empty chair at the edge of the table and pulled it out, the soft sound of wood against marble carrying through the quiet room like a statement that did not need explanation. Ava hesitated for the briefest second, not out of fear, but because she understood what that gesture meant in a place like this, and then she set her tray aside and stepped forward, her movements calm, her eyes steady, and took the seat that had just been offered. Around them, no one spoke, no one interrupted, because the meaning of that moment was unmistakable, not a reward, not a spectacle, but a restoration, a quiet correction of something that had existed long before this evening began. Dante returned to his place only after she was seated, his posture unchanged, his presence as controlled as ever, but the room no longer felt the same, because something invisible had shifted, something deeper than power, deeper than influence, something that could not be bought or arranged, only recognized. And in that silence, with every eye now aware of what had just unfolded, no explanation was needed, no declaration required, because the message had already been delivered in the only way that mattered, through action, through restraint, through the quiet understanding that respect, once revealed, does not need to be demanded. And that night, without a single raised voice, without a single moment of chaos, the room learned what dignity looks like.